Welcome to another edition of Rock Forever. We got an exciting show for you today. He is a longtime veteran rock and music journalist. He's been one of the top editors at Spin and writer for Entertainment Weekly, Billboard, New York Times, Hollywood Reporter, and many of the great trades and publications that we read. And the author of They Just Seem a Little Weird. Please welcome Doug BROD.
Hi, nice to be here.
Great to see you, Doug. It's a real pleasure. Like I always say that the '70s was the blueprint for everything that came after it. Not only the '80s and the '90s, but even today, you look at bands that are coming out, and if they make any kind of impact, people are looking for that thread. Are they like Zeppelin? Are they like Van Halen? Are they little Aerosmith? Are they, where are they drawn from? Because the '70s was such a fertile time, coming out of the '60s, which was a lot of peace and love and a lot of, singer-songwriter. We had the advent of these incredible rock bands that pretty much had creative control. They were charting their own course, and like most of these stories you tell with these four bands, it took a little while, and in some cases, it may have never fully realized. But the tagline to your book, They Just Seem a Little Weird, is how Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars remade rock and roll. So obviously, we've got to find out, how did you zero in on these four acts? I mean, obviously, there's others that could have been included. We're happy to see this list, but what was your process?
Well, from the beginning, I wanted to tell a story about '70s hard rock that had not been told before. I mean, I love the music. I love reading about the bands who made the music. But throughout my life, I mean, my first love, the first rock band I loved was Kiss. And I was really into them when I was around 11 years old, 12 years old. And then I loved Cheap Trick. And then, Aerosmith came next, and Stars actually came a lot later. I didn't really know them when I was a young kid. But the actual kind of launching point for the book was Gene Simmons's 1978 solo album, when all of the Kiss members did their own solo albums. I noticed on the back cover that he had guitarists from Aerosmith, Stars, and Cheap Trick on the album as guest stars. So you had Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick, Joe Perry from Aerosmith, and Richie Rano from Stars. And I thought that would be a really great organic place to start for a book like this, because I know that all four bands had very intense connections. And the one thing I wanted to do with the book was to show how these connections between the bands actually, formed kind of an orbit that these bands all kind of lived in. Aerosmith played with Kiss early on. They also played with Kiss in later years as well. Jack Douglas, who produced Aerosmith, also produced Cheap Trick and produced Stars. Stars was managed by Kiss's manager. So there were all of these kind of incestuous ties between these four particular bands that I wanted to explore in the book.
Well, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a really rich decade for music. So many of our favorite albums, come from that era, and the record companies just keep repackaging and box sets and remastered and all of that. Now, obviously, in the case of Aerosmith, who was really the beginning of this, they came out just before Kiss. Their first album was kind of underproduced. Without Dream On, it may have barely made a dent, but that song alone gave him enough airplay to warrant a second record. And of course, Jack Douglas comes in with Get Your Wings, and certainly I fell in love with that album and that band. besides the comparisons to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, they really had their own sound, and obviously we haven't seen a front man like Steven Tyler in a while. A ball of energy, to say the least. And then Kiss, obviously, to a lot of us, kind of crept up. Obviously their third album, they had Rock and Roll All Night on it, and that's where a lot of people first, heard them on the radio. And then of course, Kiss Alive really brought
Mhm.
the live show and the spectacle, the front cover, into the record shops and the living rooms and bedrooms, of the world. But it's always interesting to hear about the development of the bands. Obviously, Kiss really having quite a development coming from, Wicked Lester and all the other, formations into, finalizing on this concept of these characters, and of course, Cheap Trick. I first saw Cheap Trick opening for Kiss on the Love Gun tour, and
Mhm.
quite a package. You've got Kiss and all their hydraulics and moving balconies, and Cheap Trick opening was quite a combination, and I know they have quite a history. And of course, Stars, I always thought was pretty much one of the most underrated. You had a great lead singer, you had great guitarists, you had a great band. But for whatever reason, they didn't have that right song, on the radio. And I know Richie Rano complains about Capitol Records, not really being prepared for that. If they would have been on Atlantic or would have been on Columbia like Aerosmith, it could have been a different story. But certainly a great band, and music that won't go away. When you look at the development of these bands, obviously Cheap Trick came from humble Midwest roots. The rest of these
Mhm.
acts are all East Coast based, but they took them a while to really, from Fuse morph into the character that we know as Rick Nielsen, and of course Bunny Carlos, and the amazing vocals of Robin Zander, who is still killing it today. Please kind of illuminate, is there a common ground as far as the development of these bands, finding your way, finding your niche, finding that right song to hang your hat on and up your tour leverage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in Kiss's case, they started as Wicked Lester, Paul and Gene, and the band uh wasn't there was nothing actually really special about them. They were really of their time, of the early 70s. And then when they struck upon this idea of putting the makeup on and wearing costumes and doing pyro on stage and making it a lot more theatrical, obviously that's when they really hit. They got two other willing participants with Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, who were both willing to put the makeup on, to wear the costumes, and they got a hook. And once they got the hook, I mean, they became very popular very quickly. I mean, they didn't become the world-beating act they would be after Alive, but you know, they moved out of New York very soon after they started putting the makeup on, in terms of touring, not moving out of New York, but touring out of New York, opening for a lot of other artists, but then becoming headliners in their own right pretty quickly. So they were a band that got this gimmick, got this hook, and they took off fairly quickly after that. In the case of Cheap Trick, like you said, Rick and Tom were in the band called Fuse before Cheap Trick, and that was in 1969, 1970. And then they eventually morphed into Cheap Trick. Their first album came out in 77. So it took them a little while to make that move outside of the Midwest. One of the key contributing factors to their popularity was, in fact, touring with Kiss in 1977 on the Love Gun tour. because they were able to play arenas consistently throughout North America and expose the band to people who had never heard them, never seen them, and they made a ton of fans, um, important fans, just from that tour alone. And they always say, you know, both Bunny and Rick have told me that the Kiss alliance was very crucial in the early days for them, and really helped put them over. In the case of Aerosmith, like you said, they had that one album that was kind of a dud, except for Dream On. And it looked actually pretty precarious for them, you know, even making a second album for Columbia, until they were able to get an option renewed. And they hooked up with Jack Douglas and took off from there. In the case of Stars, it was a little different because they never had a grassroots following. They were a band that essentially morphed out of Looking Glass, who had a huge hit with Brandy You're a Fine Girl in 1972. And it was a soft rock song. And the guitarist, Richie Rano, came from a band called Stories, which was also kind of a soft rock band. Although, I mean, I love Stories. I love their music. Um, but it was definitely not a hard rock band the way Stars became a hard rock band. So they never had that grassroots following. They never played the dives. They never played bars. You know, when they hooked up with Bill O'Coin, who was Kiss's manager, to manage them, um, they immediately started playing arenas and theaters with the likes of ZZ Top and Peter Frampton and Roxy Music. They did not headline their own little club shows, so they were thrust into the limelight immediately, which was a really interesting, you know, thing back in the day, because not many bands had that kind of opportunity in front of them. And one of the reasons why they're in the book is to explore why a band like Stars, who had a lot of the big opportunities that other bands had, never really were able to get to that next level.
Yeah, I mean, Star's first album, Jack Douglas produced, had a lot of catchy songs, Detroit Girls and Pull the Plug and Nightcrawler and Monkey Business. And I mean, tons of super catchy songs. And you definitely got to feel that they were in that kind of Aerosmith vein. It was sleazy, it was
Mm.
gritty, it was about sex and drugs and rock and roll. But, you know, not one like radio, you know, anthem. And then, of course, with Violation, their second album, they had Cherry Baby, which was probably a little lighter than they would maybe want to be. They needed that train kept a rolling or that rock and roll all night, but you know, super catchy song, and definitely got them the most airplay. But again, wasn't necessarily the hard rock anthem, you know, that they needed. And you know, obviously took a misstep, I think, with the Attention Choppers album, not only producing themselves, but it was like a blatant attempt to move product. And, you know, the audience was really looking to organically fall in love, you know, with these bands, but they needed that one song, you know, it's like Free. They had All Right Now. They could, you know, Paul Rogers built a career out of that one song, moving into Bad Company and all that. You really needed a classic rock anthem. But yeah, like you say, there was a lot of synergy with Lieber and Krebs, Bill Coyne, and Rocksteady Management. Of course, Cheap Trick being outside of that with Ken Adamany, you know,
Mhm.
who was, I guess, you know, booking a lot of bands in the Midwest. And, you know, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe if Cheap Trick had bigger management out of New York or LA, who knows? You know, maybe there was something bigger, because obviously the Cheap Trick first album didn't have a radio hit on it. You know, great production, Jack Douglas, He's a Whore, you know, all these great songs, Hot Love, but they didn't have what they had when Tom Werman stepped in. Obviously, may not been quite as gritty, but Tom on In Color and Heaven Tonight and you know Dream Police, you know, he was known, you know, for the you know, from the Ted Nugents to the REOs and the you know, the Boston, everything he was signing um, was definitely commercial. And I know Cheap Trick kind of complained about In Color. They wanted to, put out a remixed album with Steve Albini and all that. But you know, that's where I really recognized how catchy their songs were. Like every song on In Color, and then went straight in a year later into Heaven Tonight, and then Dream Police. They were headlining arenas. I saw them headline McNichols Arena in Denver, Colorado at that point. So they'd gone from the opening act with Kiss. Just seemed like 2 years later they were arena headliners, and of course that's hard to sustain, unless you've got big hits off every album and a record label behind you. How did you see the development of these groups? Where did you see the kind of the missteps, or where some of these groups could have done better?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, in the case of Cheap Trick, you raise a really interesting point. I mean, they really broke big with at Budokan with "I Want You to Want Me" as the single. The first few records didn't really do much radio wise, um, but that album was a phenomenon, and you know they didn't expect it to be a phenomenon. They didn't expect it to have or to take on the life that it did. They had already recorded Dream Police, and they'd finished it with Werman. When that record had come out, when the live album came out, so that record sat on the shelf for something like 8 months before it came out. So the band were growing bored a little bit. I mean, they were happy for the adulation and the attention and the success, but also they have an album sitting, for 8 months that no one's heard. And that started to create some pressure in the band, which culminated, as you said, they became an arena act. I saw them play Madison Square Garden in New York in 1980, headlining, and it was their only headline show in an arena in New York in their entire career. They never again headlined an arena in New York. And one of the main reasons I suspect is that, right after they played that show, or very soon after, Tom Peterson left the band. And, it's difficult when any band loses a member, but to lose a member who was so crucial to that band. I mean, he played the 12-string bass, and he added like an orchestral booming sound to those songs. When he left, the band never recovered. They never recovered until he came back, and they had the biggest hit of their career with The Flame. That was 7 years later.
Yeah, no, I mean, all of a sudden you got George Martin, the Beatles producer, producing All Shook Up, the follow up to Dream Police, but they didn't have like a big hit on that. I mean, you can only imagine the cost of production,
Mm-hmm.
and Epic must have been, disappointed, and obviously, like you said, until they had the Flame and they started. Next time I saw them in a in an arena, they were co-headlining with Heart. Cheap Trick had the Flame out, and Heart had those big '80s hits.
Mm-hmm.
And you know the common thread between that, a lot of people may not know, was their the A&R guy, at Epic, and brought
Don Grierson.
yeah, Don Grierson brought Hart to Capitol. He was a song guy. He was like,
Mm-hmm.
look, I don't care who the F writes these songs. We need a hit on the radio. Most people don't even check the credits. You know what I mean? I know Cheap Trick were offended by the Flame, but they're like, man, you're all over the radio. You're back in arenas. So let's not worry about who wrote the song. Hopefully it inspires you to write the next one this big. But yeah, the late Don Grierson, who I got to know quite well, was an amazing song guy. And Hart too. They were offended, with those '80s songs. They're like, well, we got all these outside writers. You guys are puffing our hair up and putting the bustier on. Hey, they had the biggest sales ever. Even the Nancy Wilson song, was
Well,
through the roof.
yeah, I mean, a lot of, in fact, like the three of the bands other than Stars in my book, they all went through that. I mean, at a certain point, these bands that have been around for almost 50 years, they need a little help. They need a little, if it's the gas tank is empty, they're getting complacent, they're lacking confidence. Something happens where the record company recognizes that, okay, we need to goose them a little bit, so let's bring in some outsiders. And in Cheap Trick's case, they resisted. They were not happy having Diane Warren and Nick Graham and whomever else being thrust upon them. In Kiss's case, I mean, they in their own words, got a little lazy. I mean, Gene Simmons checked out of the band for a while, even though he was in it. He went off to Hollywood to make movies and left Paul to be the creative center of the band. And they started getting a lot of help with the writing. And in the case of Aerosmith, when they came back with Permanent Vacation, I mean, they were happy to use Desmond Child, who who co-wrote some huge hits with them. And then they had people like Marty Fredrickson come in and Mark Hudson came in to help out with the songwriting. So Aerosmith seemed to be a little more agreeable to having writers come in. And it really helped them. And someone like Desmond Child, he also helped Kiss a lot as well. I mean, he co-wrote I Was Made for Loving You and some of their bigger hits when they took the makeup off. So he's in the book, and he was really instrumental to reviving both Kiss and Aerosmith's careers.
Yeah, I mean, we're waiting for Joe Perry to come back, and Done with Mirrors was like a dud. I mean, until Desmond Child came in and they really went for the MTV jugular, they were destined to be a has-been. So it really turned them around. Now, in the case of Stars, do you think, because I don't remember any co-writers really,
No.
do you think they should have, I don't know who their A&R person was, but do you think they should have maybe investigated writing a big rock anthem with a known writer?
Well, it's funny you say that, because what you had mentioned, Attention Shoppers, and Attention Shoppers, their third record was a very polarizing record, from what I understand. I mean, I didn't even I knew about Stars in the 70s. I never listened to the music, but I heard them in the early 2000s when they re-released the records on CD via Rykodisc, and I fell in love with the band, even though I hadn't really known about them. And I started seeing them when they did reunion shows in New York and New Jersey. But they actually didn't have a long enough career to think about bringing in new writers. With Attention Shoppers, I mean, they told me, the band members told me, they were given strict marching orders by Capitol and Bill O'Coin, their manager. You must write pop hits. We want an album of pop hits. They wanted an album full of hits like Cherry Baby. And as you said, Cherry Baby was not really representative of that hard rock sound. I think it's a fantastic song. It's probably their best song, my favorite song of theirs, but it's really kind of a power pop song. It's not a hard rock song per se. And they were conceived as a hard rock band. So you could look at an album like Attention Shoppers and say, oh, this is kind of lightweight, but the songs are really, really strong, in my words, in my opinion. But they really never had a long enough career to bring in other people. However, Brendan Harkin, who is one of the original guitarists, told me that he was hoping at some point they would have brought in a Bob Ezrin, who had worked with Kiss on Destroyer. And he thinks someone like Bob Ezrin, as a collaborator, who's also a songwriter, would have probably given him the help that they needed to really take them over the top.
Yeah, I mean, with Attention Shoppers, good catchy songs, but yeah, maybe they needed a Bruce Fairbairn or somebody, with that Bon Jovi touch, that really would take those songs into a little more of an edgy, rock radio, vein. Obviously, I think a huge mistake, in producing themselves. Yeah, you might save a few dollars, but you're hanging on to your career. You know, you got Coliseum Rock that came out that was obviously more edgy. They were trying to answer all the fans that said, "Man, that was a lightweight, album," but again, nothing near radio. And like you say, at that point, it was over. You know,
Well,
Capitol's not going to stick with you for more than 4 albums.
yeah, well, one of the problems that they had, and I get into it pretty deeply in the book, is that was an era, the mid to late 70s, when uh quote unquote classic rock radio was beginning, and tightening of playlists, and the AOR format was taking hold. And the guy who created that format, Lee Abrams, um a lot of bands felt left out because it was a very regimented, data driven, research driven concept and format. And if you're a new band that hasn't sold a lot of records and never really, broke out past the opening band status on an arena bill like Stars, it was very difficult for you to get that kind of traction and to get those kinds of get that kind of attention from these radio programmers. So your music just got pushed aside and never got played, and that was the problem with a band like Stars.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about pre MTV. Radio was everything. I mean, yeah, you had record stores and you had a few of these publications, but obviously Rolling Stone was really broad. They weren't focused on hard rock, and you know, you had your Circus and Cream and all that. But again, you needed a song. People needed a song to really connect. I mean, obviously, it showed with Kiss. I mean, Kiss was starting to get a cult audience, with the makeup and the pyro, but until they had Rock and Roll All Night, you never really heard them on the radio. And
Mhm.
radio was absolutely everything back then. And now with the internet, it's hard to even imagine that. But that was the era. If you're going in the record store, you're usually asking the clerk, "Hey, you got that band that does that song, Rock and Roll All Night? Who are they? Oh yeah, here's the record right here." So it really hurt. Stars, and we look back, and again, an influential group, but that's not enough. The Aerosmiths and Cheap Tricks, and all of these artists, Kiss, obviously still doing these large, whether it's a farewell tour or these retro tours, greatest hits, where people want to come out. Now it's pretty amazing this year to see, of all these bands, one of these bands coming out with vital new music, and that's Cheap Trick. I mean, I referred to it earlier. Robin Zander is like an American treasure. I mean, his voice is as strong as it was in 1977, and there's very few singers that can claim that. And he's still got the growl and the bite, and still the smooth harmony and melodic sense. And I mean, what can you say? Kiss really hasn't had that. Aerosmith certainly didn't have that. Their last album being a dud with all the ballads on it. Stars not really having a record since Coliseum Rock to
Mhm.
speak of. So, what can you say about Cheap Trick still making a record almost every year, still having that vitality of being able to say, yeah, we got new music. Yeah, we may be a band from the 70s, but check it out. We're on the charts right now.
Yeah, I love this new record. I mean, I cut Cheap Trick a lot of slack because they're my all-time favorite band, and I know that a lot of their records are kind of um, but this one is, I think, their best record since their 1997 self-titled album, which was kind of their first indie record. I mean, the songs are just terrific. The sound, like you said, is just brilliant. I mean, Robin is just still an extraordinary singer. He's my favorite rock singer of all time. Um, and they're still a lot of fun live. I see them, I mean, I saw them before the pandemic. I saw them whenever I could. And which, you know, I've seen them probably 51 times so far in my life. And I just love them. And, you know, it's funny, they're making records for themselves. That's what they say all the time. They're making them because they want to make them. They don't have to make them, because when you go see them, they play maybe one new song from the record in concert, and then everything else are, you know, their greatest hits or maybe some deep album cuts, but they never play a lot of new music live. It's mostly nostalgia driven, frankly. So they don't need to make these records, but they do, and they, you know, they do it for us. I mean, I just find it great that they're still making records, and you know, they're catering to the fans. So, you know, it's very admirable. And you know, at the same time, one thing that really struck me when I finished the book is I realized, you know, all four of these bands are still active in some fashion. I mean, you know, Aerosmith were in the midst of this Las Vegas residency before the pandemic struck. Kiss were going through their end of the road tour before the pandemic struck. Cheap Trick, you know, were opening for ZZ Top and supposedly going to start playing with Rod Stewart and going, you know, doing their own headlining, you know, theater tours. So they were always playing around. And then Stars were about to embark on a tour with Angel, another kind of B-level band from the 70s. So they were all still active nearly 50 years later, which as a fan of the music, is just like extraordinary to me. And who else does that? I mean, there are so few bands that actually are consistently going out there and playing from that era.
Well, Cheap Trick is so strong, as you know. Rick Nielsen and the boys, they write the set every night fresh before they go on, and they have at least 200 to 300 songs to choose from. And of
Mhm.
course, you know, Rick's kid Dax on drums got to know the whole catalog, even though he didn't, you know, come up playing it. And it's pretty amazing that, of course, they're going to do, you know, 70-80% of the hits. Like you say,
Mhm.
if they're in the opening slot, they got no time to waste. You know, they got to leave the fans screaming for more. But you know, the fact that they can switch it up, I think Cheap Trick has said, we've never done the same set 2 nights in a row. You know, they will always throw something in there. And, you know, I'm curious to hear what you think. I mean, the catalog is so voluminous and so many great things. I thought the Woke Up with a Monster, the one album they did with Ted Templeman on Warner Brothers, was kind of underrated. A lot of people sweep that under the rug, and obviously Warner didn't think the sales were enough to keep going. But especially like the title track on that, I thought, you know, it showed so much power, and you know, Robin was just kicking ass. What are your thoughts on Woke Up with a Monster?
I think that album has a great first side. And then it just kind of peters out for me. It's not one of my favorites, to be honest with you. But yeah, but I admired what they were trying to do. In fact, you know, Rick has said that they saw that record as the first album in their second life. As it turned out, because it was their first album since leaving Epic, and an album where they were actually given creative freedom. You know, for the two final albums on Epic, Richie Zito, the producer, had um, a lot to say in what they got recorded, and I think those records are really patchy with some good songs mixed in with a lot of garbage, frankly. But at least with Woke Up with a Monster, they made a record they wanted to make. You know, it could be argued that it wasn't creatively their strongest batch of songs, and I would argue that. Um, but you know, it did what it needed to do, I guess, but didn't do enough. And then, you know, there was an upheaval, from what I understand, at the record company at Warner Brothers. And then that was also a period where Cheap Trick, you know, fired Ken Adamany. So there was a lot of turmoil going on behind the scenes at that period. And it wasn't until 1997 when they released the self-titled album, which was, which was actually the beginning of their second life, I would say. But that record too became embroiled with, bad corporate politics, and the label folded very soon after the record was released. So, they didn't have a lot of luck during that era. They had a lot of luck, but it was bad. So, but they managed to rebound, and they released a string of records during the during the late 90s, early 2000s, and have been on this incredibly prolific streak for the past, 10 years or so. They've been just releasing records constantly, and good for them.
Yeah, no, it's there's so many great songs in their catalog, but I think the new album really they put together a consistent album, front to back. I mean, we heard it kind of in bits and pieces as they would release the singles, but to listen to that album all the way through, there's really not a lot of lull in there. It's
Hmm.
really a lot of a lot of great writing. Can't wait to see what else they do. But yeah, once they start going independent between the Red Ants and the Big Three and the Big Machine and all that, you're dependent on those companies staying focused and staying funded, and they're all competing in a sense with the majors. So it's whoever the investors are might get cold feet, unless the millions are flowing back to them. But yeah, no, what an incredible book. I highly recommend it to all the music lovers that especially love not only these bands but the vital music that came from the 70s. That music, as I say, was the dominant blueprint for the 80s. I'm not real excited about the term hair metal, but the whole Sunset Strip scene that was also highly influenced by Van Halen was, you know um, predominantly coming off all those 70s influences, Aerosmith and Kiss and all of that. And you know like you put the reference into even grunge. I know Kurt Cobain said some of his favorite influences were more of this catchy rock and pop stuff. It came out in a kind of a tortured alternative vein, but super super influential music. So the book again is called They Just Seem a Little Weird, and of course that is a line from the Mighty Mighty Cheap Trick hit Surrender, which I know Gene Simmons gets a smile every time they mention Got My Kiss records out. I mean, what a phenomenal pop culture song and album that was. But our special guest has been Doug Broad. He's a veteran journalist and writer. He's got an amazing book. You need to go out and get this thing. They Just Seem a Little Weird. Available on Amazon and everywhere you find your favorite books. Doug, thank you so much for joining us. We really look forward to keeping up on any new books, adventures, or anything you got going on.
Thanks. Great to be here. Appreciate it.